understand how we can ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices. There are two ways you can do this today. First, by buying books from Haymarket at haymarketbooks.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. If you like this event, be sure to catch these upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast, Haymarket Live, wherever you get your podcasts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. We should have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Yeah. Does someone mind dropping anything I should know because I wasn't in the conversation earlier?
Hey everyone, welcome to our talk today. My name is Miles. I'm a part of Books Against Borders and other migrant justice organising here in London, and I'm really glad to be here talking today about resisting borders and technologies of violence with my friends and comrades. Malika, who is a member of Migrants Organise, who will be joining me in chairing, and we're really lucky to have Mizue Aizeki, Mahmoudi, and Harsha Walia here to talk with us. So Mizue is the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Resistance Lab and has been organising to end the injustices at the intersections of the criminal and migration control systems for years, and has led multiple policy and individual case campaigns to end the entanglement of local law enforcement and ICE policing. Matt is a lecturer, researcher, and organizer, as well as helping forming the No Tech for Tyrants collective. He leads Amnesty International's Ban the Scan campaign against facial recognition technologies from New York City to occupy Palestinian territories. He's affiliated lecturer in sociology and was the inaugural Joe Cox PhD scholar at University of Cambridge. Both Mizue and Matt are co-editors, along with Colleen Schupfer, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, of the book Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence, available from Haymarket Books. And we're also joined by Harsha Walia, who is active in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements, and is the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism and Border and Rule. This launch today is launching a reading group that Migrants, Organise and Books Against Borders are running starting this month here in London. We're very sorry that not everybody can join that, but we wanted to have some online public events to first open up that conversation and get to grips with some of the themes of the book. We'll be having another online event at the end of October, kind of covering some of the things that we've gone through in that reading group. So we hope you can join us for that too. In the event today, we'll be having discussion on some of the themes with our speakers, and we may have some time for some Q&A at the end. So if you do want to drop questions in the YouTube chat, please do. I'm going to pass over to Malika now. But yeah, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Miles. And yeah, just really excited to be here with all y'all and have a really exciting conversation. And I wanted to start maybe with you, Matt, and others, just to think about, as we're meeting here today in September 2024, after quite a year and quite a while of intense political escalation around the themes of this book, thinking like 6 months after the publication of this book, and as we witness and resist an ongoing genocide in Palestine, and here in Britain, as we reckon with the aftermath of recent far-right mobilizations, I'm curious if you could share a bit about why resisting border technology matters right now in this moment. And if you'd like to maybe share an example of what this has looked like to resist border technologies of violence in this context for you. Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Malika, and thank you for having us here today. I guess to start by saying that, yes, it matters now to resist technologies of bordering, not necessarily because those technologies are nascent and new, but because of the critical energy and mobilization that has emerged on the back of understanding the ways in which these technologies play a role in accentuating, perpetuating, further intensifying aspects of border marginality and border imperialism, as per Harsha's work, genocide and apartheid globally. And we're seeing that unfold before our eyes and have been seeing that for nearly a year. That's not because the technology is particularly new, as Mizue will undoubtedly also touch upon, as far as the sort of long tail of the history of Homeland Security, state building, and the technologies that goes into that. A lot of these technologies are rooted, way back to the invention of the passport and ways of sorting between bodies and trying to make legible aspects of really marginality that are being codified into bodies that are presented as other, and then right onto the ways in which we see that play out through biometric technologies today, whether they are facial recognition, gait recognition technology, motion recognition technology, any form of technology that attempts to use as little of our corporeal real estate as possible to make grand determinations about who we are, and by extension, and who we can associate with and where we can live. But as far as why it matters now, to some extent, the tangibility that has been given to some of these technologies, as invisible and obfuscated as they have been over the last decade or two, has given us an opportunity to better understand the ways in which different nodes of power and levers present themselves as opportunities for mobilization. So thinking about, for example, the ways in which tech workers have been mobilizing around, in particular, Project Nimbus, which is a cloud infrastructure platform that has been serving a lot of the target acquisition systems and other systems that are being used in the context of military action by Israeli authorities against Palestinians and the unfolding genocide in Gaza. We now understand better exactly how the companies that are involved in producing those cloud infrastructure produce those technologies, what they plug in with and what power we hold as either tech workers or as government workers or as individuals that effectively touch in some ways upon the algorithmic supply chains that plug into the genocide as it's unfolding. And by knowing and understanding those relationships, there is a moment for pause and there's a moment to resist and refuse, as we saw with some of the Google workers that refused to be complicit in the continued export and development of the Nimbus project, as we saw with the Amazon workers who also said no to the Nimbus project, as we saw with the Microsoft workers that have said no to Azure cloud services being provided. And as we continue to see in activists that show up at tech company headquarters and block them from being able to enter those buildings, and as we continue to see from shipping workers that refuse to export weapons technologies that are being developed by also high-tech manufacturers. So there are opportunities there that we're continuing to visibilize, and that's in part what this book is about. And what we're hoping that it'll do is it'll help us make tangible some of the obfuscated ways in which power continues to be concentrated and allow for large-scale violence like genocide to play out, by helping us know exactly where we can intervene in the different spaces that we occupy in our various different everyday lives.
Thanks so much, Matt. And yeah, everything you said there about this moment as one with so much energy in our movements of resistance is so spot on. Going to open it to other speakers. I think Mizue, did you want to come in on this?
Sure, I can come in. First of all, thanks to you both, Migrants, Organise and Haymarket, for opening up this conversation and also for publishing the anthology, Haymarket. I was thinking about one of the chapters in the book by Jeff Helper. It's called Global Palestine, Exporting Israel's Regime of Population Control. And in the piece, Jeff says, how he talks about how this normalization of the Zionist settler colonial project that's extending over the entirety of historic Palestine. And I just wanted to sit for a minute with this idea of normalization of settler colonialism. And I think that there's a tendency to think that it's a process in some places that's over, that was the past, right? And I think what's really critical about what we are seeing in what's happening in Palestine is a few different things I just wanted to talk about, which is one of them was kind of the point that Jeff Helper talks about is this idea of population control and population management, right? And how is it then that technology facilitates this in a way that becomes so normalized, right? Matt talked about the passport, and we think about then the rights that are attached to a passport. I think that there is less than 10% of the world's population can cross international boundaries, right? With authorization or legally recognized as being able to do so. And I think the other thing that it's fundamentally about land and territory, right? And so, in this moment, now we are in the 21st century, and you're seeing what the Israeli government is doing in Palestine. And I was thinking about this idea of how the state is the only state-sanctioned violence, right, is seen as legitimate violence, right? And so that's part of the power of being a state. And how the settler colonial project and the normalization of it legitimates all sorts of the most horrible things that can happen to people as a result of borders, right? And so, there is this famous quote by Ishila Membe, right? Which is, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but I think we're all fairly familiar with it, about the power of sovereignty to determine who has the right to live and who must die. And I think that what is really important to reflect upon is how, in a situation where a genocidal regime is in such stark view, why is it allowed to persist in this way? What is the function of Israel's role in producing kind of technologies for liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes that allows this to persist? You know, what is it about a settler colonial project in this very particular context that is not even contested as that? I don't think anymore that that's what that is, right? I just think that it's just really important to think about then if we were to see the homeland security state in which those of us who live in what's called the United States are in, right? Where can we see the parallels? What have we normalized as part of the logics of conquest and control? And why undoing the bordering is such a critical part of getting us to the world where we want to be.
Thanks, Mizue. I'm going to pass to Miles again.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for that. I think, that analysis of the relationship between settler colonialism and this broader bordering project is really important. I'm sure one will continue through this conversation. I think so. One of the real achievements of the book is the geographical breadth of its contributors and case studies, and the way it effectively links those things together and really speaks to the international and intersecting nature of border technologies and migration control regimes, right? And the collaborations across borders between the developers of these technologies and the states that implement them, and the colonial legacies and settler colonial, present of those different states. And as both of you, I think, pointed to there, Palestine has really been a powerful demonstration of this over the past year, and obviously for a long time. I think, and as you say, Jeff Halper's piece in the book, as well as Marwa Fatafta's piece, really illustrate that. But this is also something that's witnessed really significantly on the ground organizing over the past year against the current genocidal campaign. And so I'm thinking in particular of like Palestine Action, Palestinian Youth Movement, even Energy Embargo for Palestine, who have really identified multinational targets like Elbit Systems, Maersk, and their shipping logistics company, and BP. And so there's this really quite intentional and actually quite encouraging broader strategic trend of organizing kind of against the arteries and connections of imperialism that do go across borders and across industries, right? So really driving home Ruthie Gilmore's conclusion that the only thing we need to change is everything. So thinking about those intersections, Harsha, I know I speak for I'm sure many people watching this, when I say that your theorization of border imperialism has been really immensely helpful in thinking through those connections in relation to global border regimes. So I wondered if you could speak a little to the role and necessity of internationalism today with that in mind, and in particular where you feel we're at in terms of international anti-border organizing, and maybe what more needs to be done.
Thanks, Miles, and thank you everyone for this conversation. And congratulations again on the book. It's so good and so important. So thank you all for all your time and effort in getting the book together, putting it out there, and to you all for hosting this conversation to get the ideas of this book kind of further out. Just echoing what has already been said, I think that it's so crucial to understand that in thinking about border technologies, it really is just so central to settler colonialism and border imperialism, right? And I think that's really important to stress, because sometimes people like me who don't work in tech, it can be incredibly overwhelming to think about tech as somehow outside of these processes of racial imperialism, racial capitalism, border imperialism, and more, right? It can become incredibly nuanced. It can feel really policy focused. And so I really appreciate that in thinking about opposing border technology, we're thinking about it through the lens of anti-border, anti-imperialist politics, and seeing it as an extension of many, many processes that are long-standing, right? And so Both of you mentioned how so many of these technologies of control they're just expediting existing processes. Simone Brown's work, for example, in talking about passports, as was mentioned, and how conditions of anti-Indigenous genocide and anti-Blackness, global anti-Blackness, has always been about population control, has always been about surveillance, has always been about population management, right? And so to understand tech as part of these trajectories, as something that escalates these trajectories and obfuscates and invisibilizes it, is really, I think, the key point in undoing border technologies, right? So it is both about understanding technology as a form and a method and pillar of these structural processes, and seeing how technology allows these violences to be globalized, right? So it's not necessarily that it's new, but the escalation and globalization of it is what I think we have to pay the most attention to. And so, in terms of in this moment, what internationalism might mean, particularly as it relates to border technologies, I would offer maybe a few things. One is the ways in which border technologies really expedites the method of border outsourcing, or what is formally known as, border externalization. And so border externalization is just this idea that, the border exists everywhere. It has always existed everywhere. But increasingly, imperial countries and countries in the core, if you will, increasingly outsource the border literally to everywhere, right? So we see that in the Mediterranean. We see that in the ways in which the EU externalizes the border to the Sahel region of Africa, the ways in which the United States externalizes the border to South and Central America and to the Caribbean. And so, and on and on and on. And so border technologies have really allowed for the escalation of border outsourcing, such that it really becomes a pillar of imperialism, right? So in order for most countries, for example, most countries in Africa now, a condition of trade and aid agreements with the EU, as you both will know because you're based there, a condition of trade and aid agreements really is migration management. And one of the key methods of that is trading in border technologies, right? And so everywhere from the Mediterranean to Mexico to Panama to Haiti to the Dominican Republic, we have the outsourcing of border technologies. And key in that, and this was the second point that's already been made, key to that is Israeli surveillance specifically, right? And so when people write about Palestine as a lab, when we talk about Palestine as a paradigm, when we talk about Palestine as a surveillance model of the world, this is like not a metaphor, right? It is literally the hub of surveillance technologies. We know that Israel battle tests currently in the genocide and previously all of its technologies in order to export them. And border security technologies is a key part of what Israel exports to the rest of the world. Elbit systems, of course, being such a key example of that. Elbit is one of Israel's largest defense contractors. It operates at the border in Arizona. It also operates all around the world, including, of course, the apartheid wall in Palestine itself. Scotiabank, so I live in Canada. Scotiabank has a relationship with Elbit. And so our resistance is able to be globalized because this violence is also globalized, right? These nodes, Miles, as you mentioned, can be disrupted literally anywhere and everywhere. And that makes it so important. Elbit is also in the Mediterranean as part of the border surveillance of Fortress EU. And so I think this becomes incredibly important, both in terms of disrupting the nodes of violence itself, but also I would say the last thing is that it really becomes a critical methodological form of also disrupting imperialist logic, right? Like so much of border security promotion, like the entire logic that it is sold on is the idea of the hordes, the invaders. That is also how Israel battle tests and sells its propaganda and its surveillance, right? Especially since 9/11, Israel has pitched itself as the so-called democratic secure oasis in the region. And so the deeply racialized, orientalist, imperialist logics that underpin how even border security technologies is sold around the world to imperial countries like India, I think it becomes so important to disrupt that as part of the logic, because that is the logic upon which it is sold and the logic upon which it is traded. So border technology becomes such a crucial method of understanding and unraveling imperialism around the world today and building internationalist resistance. Those maps and those memes, right, of like everywhere that Israel has sold technologies to may seem simple, but they're so powerful in understanding how militarism, capitalism, and racial imperialism are all bound up together.
Thank you. Yeah. Those maps. I think yeah, being able to really visualize that illustrates it so much, and a lot of those connections I think are really lucid in a lot of people's minds. Now, Matt, Mizue, did either of you want to come in on that?
That was really great, Harsha. Thank you. I think there was a lot in there. I just wanted to maybe add a couple of things to that point. Because you referenced the idea of the border being everywhere, and a lot of how we're understanding it as we put the book together, Matt, Colleen, and I, this idea of really thinking about this thing that we call the everywhere border, where it's not just what we think of as border policing technologies or policing technologies, but as you said, Harsha, it's these logics that underlie everything around governance, right? And what technology then enables is technological infrastructures that are put into place that have, some people might call them dual use functions, right? We have an ID card system. Well, that seems like this is a key form of governance, and we're going to collect all your biometrics as a piece of that. And then, Aadhaar, the example that's in the book, but also one that's held up as a model for the world, that's the Indian biometric digital ID card, is one that's been weaponized, right, to deny, rural workers from access to services. It's like, very much linked to governance systems, but also then weaponized against Muslims, trans people, and gender diverse people. And so this is kind of the idea that we try to really get people to think around is like, how has border policing and the Homeland Security state or national security in this moment, how is it a continuum of all the things, as Harsha mentioned, but also how is it really shaping governance today through these things that are so core to how people are managed, right? ID systems, public benefit systems, financial systems, right? Like there is a legitimate war on cash by corporations. That's what they call it, right? And so why? Why is legibility of all people? Why is cataloging of all people? Why is stacking of all people in hierarchies become such like a durable and central part of governance today? And what is technology doing to fuel it? I think is really the thing that we're trying to untangle. And I just, think that it was a really important part of the journey of the book to both have the historical continuum, but the case studies then of how people are fighting them, right? So it's not as if we just need to show this parade of horribles. It's like, these are the tools and the tactics, strategies that people are deploying around the world. And I think to the point that you raised, Harsha, about the powers that be in the continuum of powers, it was really important to put into conversation the U.S. and the EU and UK as like key colonial powers that have laid the foundation for a lot of these infrastructures of control and the enduring logics that continue to order the world in a particular way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the border is everywhere and historic, but not forever. Great, I will pass over to Malika now. Thanks.
I feel like all of the pieces of that last bit of conversation around how there are so many international opportunities for our resistance and how crucial it is, and something I think this book does really well is, how crucial it is to understand border technology as something that accelerates existing structural logics, such that our resistance too is not about just resisting technology, but about resisting, racism, capitalism, imperialism, and the border, which kind of leads into the next question, which is for folks who are organizing and folks who are taking action and mobilizing in community, and especially for folks whose movement spaces maybe aren't focused on the technology, but are focused on combating these structural forms of oppression, and thinking about what can we learn from this space, and what does that look like for us as organizers, and especially when we're thinking about abolition as our horizon. It becomes quite important for us to have a really solid power analysis, for us to know what a win looks like, and for us to know what a non-reformist reform, as some are calling it, like looks like, versus what are the steps that actually strengthen the power of the systems we're trying to break down. And so the next question is open to all of y'all, but thinking about this relationship between tech companies and the state, which is increasingly privatized, how does what we're seeing kind of inform and shift our power analysis as organizers? And related to that, especially as digital border violence is often presented as this sort of softer or more ethical alternative way of securitizing and criminalizing, what can organizers be aware of in deciding, what is actually our win? What does non-reformist reform look like? And are there experiences or stories that you can bring to illustrate this?
I have some thoughts. And again, this comes as someone who barely understands tech. I couldn't even log on to the Skype call today. And so, this is for fellow organizers who are like, how to make sense of border tech in organizing. So these are just some very concrete pieces that I'll put out there that I think that we've learned in the context of some of our organizing, and maybe it'll resonate. And I'd love to hear from folks if it does or doesn't. And picking up on something that you'd said, Malika, around, one of the ways in which border technologies is presented is this idea that it's a softer form of securitization or softer policing or softer criminalization. And, one of the things, for example, that Canada has been piloting is AI in asylum decision-making, right? And so because for so long, one of the challenges to the border regime has been the arbitrariness of decision-making, right? So that some judges in the asylum system, for example, have a 98% acceptance rate and others have a 2% acceptance rate, which from the perspective of radical migrant justice organizers is the fact that someone can decide that you have the right to asylum at all. That is the core issue. But for a lot of liberals, the arbitrariness of the system is what they focus on. And so for a lot of them, AI in decision-making is seen as a positive because they see AI and the algorithms as quote unquote unbiased, right? Of course, we know there is no such thing as an unbiased algorithm. But a lot of people have picked up on AI in decision-making as a counter to the arbitrariness of the asylum system. And so, for us, this is as a migrant justice movement, this is something that has been divisive between so-called liberals and radical arms of the movement for these reasons. And so I think this may mimic things coming up in other places where people are similar to AI, have also been much more willing to accept electronic monitoring as an alternative to detention. And so these kinds of examples that really just actually embolden the carceral system, that don't get to the root issues around, the border logic and the legitimacy of the border, I feel squarely have to be rejected because they just expand the surveillance carceral net in other forms. Electronic monitoring is just having people agree to, carcerate their own body, right? And oftentimes the kinds of restrictions are so immense and the conditions are even longer. And so these kinds of alternatives, technological alternatives to what we see as the detention center, the prison, the jail, etc., are not alternatives. They are extensions of. And so I think those are squarely reformist reforms that should be rejected and are technologies that should be rejected. I think the other thing that I would offer is that strategically, it is so important to target companies, like Elbit, like Google, like Amazon, etc., because they're literally evil giants. At the same time, it is so necessary as Ruthie Gilmore would remind us, for example, about the prison industrial complex, that the motive is not always profit, right? And so Ruthie tells us to understand these companies as parasites, but that they're not the end of how we have to understand these logics. And so I think it is really important that in thinking about how to target the border security kind of complex, that while we are strategically thinking about certain companies that, you know, we should be targeting, that we also don't forget the underlying logic of the border is the state, right? These security companies and these border technologies are able to make a profit off of these technologies because the border exists, right? Because the logic of bordering exists. And so it's really important to keep in mind that while there is a profit motive that companies feed off of, the logics of these are much deeper. And it's not about singular companies. And so I think that is really important, you know, to not really create these huge distinctions between the so-called public and private realm, because they work in tandem and the logics feed off of each other. And then the last thing that I would offer up is, you know, really to squarely in thinking about these kinds of agreements, you know, like Project Nimbus and other things, is to also, again, going to some of the core of these trade agreements that facilitate these security partnerships. And I think, you know, one of the things that perhaps we pay less attention to, since, you know, I grew up in the globalization movement, in the anti-globalization movements, we're really thinking about trade and imperialism and capitalism as conjoined was so central to our thinking. And so I think one thing that border technologies and resisting border technologies allows us to do is to put the light back on some of these multilateral, bilateral trade agreements, and of course the unfair logics of them and the ways in which security partnerships have become central to imperialism. Thinking about these through the matrix of trade and security partnerships a bit more deeply, and targeting those trade agreements and security partnerships at their core, in addition to finding those much more strategic leverage points. I don't know if that was useful, but that's like my one-track mind at the moment.
Very useful. I was hurriedly writing all of this down so I can think about it for hours later. Matt or Mizue, did you want to jump in? Or Miles, for that matter?
I can, unless, Matt, you're poised to answer something.
I can go after you, please.
Okay. There's so much to say. I'm going to try to be as concise as I can, but I really love, Harsha, that you brought in the trade agreements and kind of the global economic order, because I also think, I might be a little bit older than you, but I'm also like, that was a very key in my political development, to have like the World Bank and the IMF be like a household name in our like political thinking about global power. And I think my first response, which isn't a really very well received often by people, to your question, Malika, is that it's complicated, right? And like, we really have to understand kind of the power that we're up against and the interests that are underlying it in a way that no one's going to teach you in public education, right? Especially if you like live in the belly of the beast, right? So it's like, you have to kind of think about, what are the things that are being concealed from you, and why? Who do I go to try to learn more? Like, find a mentor or something. Like, but I think that the thing about being older is like, I never thought that when I was coming of age politically in the late 80s and the 1990s, that my key political work would be against a new agency founded by the US government in, you know, at the big dawn of the 21st century, that had in its mindset that the American homeland is the planet, right? That has basically fused like militarism, national security, public safety, and the border into all the things. And I think, like, I say this often to the younger people, is like in 1990, when I went down to the US-Mexico border, there were many places where there was no wall, right? You had President Nixon's wife saying to Mexicans at some point, like, my vision is one day this wall will be all gone. And it was a barbed wire fence at that time. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I also think the other thing that referencing like these large scale global movements against free trade agreements, right? And the Zapatista uprising, and you can see how there are moments in history, the post-colonial movements, there are moments in history where I think the power to counter the power feels very visible, right? And so what am I trying to say? I think it's like someone who's like lived through like the Cold War shaped my life, right? Moving into like the ascendancy of neoliberalism, and then now what I call the Homeland Security state. I think it's really helpful to really think about the fundamental underlying power structures that are so invested in the world being a certain way, the age-old logics and hierarchies that they rely upon to order the world in that way, and how we actually live in a time period of what I call vengeful governance, right? Which is very much of like the neoliberal Rudy Giuliani, policing the poor and blaming people who have the least in the world as the source of all the problems, right? That form of crisis management has been very resilient. And I think to a point, Harsha said the liberals, it's like we have to really grapple with the fact that this is very comfortably held in liberal democracies around the world, right? And so why authoritarianism is real and something we should be thinking about and organizing around. And while there are techno-fascists that have like outsized power and wealth, I think the point, coming back to your question, is like, how do we understand this very comfortable marriage of a carceral state and a corporate money making, like, or global economy, right? Which is very, very, what am I trying to say? The border industrial complex is just so lucrative for them, right? And so I think that's kind of to your point of like non-reformist, your question. What I often try to think, what I think about is how I was, I remember when critical resistance was founded, and I was in and around a lot of that space, and the centrality of thinking about organizing what Ruthie would call the worst of the worst, right? And as we're organizing, if what we're doing is not at least somehow opening up the space for liberation, for whom the system legitimates the oppression, then we're not going to get there. So if I could give a concrete example, in my work in the United States, the work that I did was mostly on what they would call the criminal alien, right? And that's like a range of people. That could be people who you are a criminal alien because you just don't have papers to be in the United States, to the person who has a murder conviction and did time and faces deportation because of it. I think the thing that was really hard for me in that 10, 12 years of doing that organizing is seeing how, because the system exists in the way that it does, it has hierarchies. To win rights for some, it was always throwing certain groups of people under the bus. And you can't just use the words. You can't just say, we're all fighting to liberate everybody, but not actually think about what your strategies are doing to lock the system down on people who have the least amount of rights. I have a lot to say about that, but I also just think it's just really important to understand how the durability of a system is so tied into othering and criminalization, and it can't just be a narrative fix, but it has to start there to unlock the strategy towards the liberation of all. I think I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll stop there.
Am I okay to come in here?
Go on, Matt.
Harsha, Mizue, thank you so much for those interventions. I've just sat here taking notes and fanboying very hard. But to try and just add a sliver of a contribution to this discussion, it's imminently clear, I think, to me, that racial capitalism is always in search for some form of scapegoat. And it's clear that scapegoatism can be obfuscated through ways in which systems that are technocratic, that appear to be positioned as neutral, that appear to be positioned as somehow rooted in science and positivism, emerge as ways in which that very scapegoatism is then dusted under the carpet. And so hence, what you're referring to here, Mizue, as sort of the power to counter power becoming invisibilized and becoming less clear. And I think to that end, we have a bit of a double-edged sword, as it were, because we have a situation in which with the AI systems and the tech and the language around those technologies that really, I think sort of undercut the bigger discussions that need to be had around the institutions and the regulation and the agreements, et cetera, that we've just discussed that really belie the international order. That it's a double-edged sword insofar as, on the one hand, it does the obscuring, and on the other hand, it also provides low-hanging fruit for interrogating and getting into the conversation around exactly how particular products are wound up with particular politics, with particular geopolitics, with particular agreements, with particular forms of violence. And it requires an approach to critically interrogating capitalism that is fundamentally attuned to supply chains and where they play out, and to analyzing that from an understanding of exactly how geopolitics play out through those supply chains. And I think that's something that that we're beginning to see more and more of through conversations around things like Nimbus. And I think like being able to trace companies like Palantir, which we've all worked on and talked about at length, through both the violence that they impart or allow ICE to impart on undocumented migrants in Mississippi, right down to the large language models that they're providing the Israeli defense, to Elbit systems and what they're doing in Israel versus the surveillance towers that they're providing on the U.S. southern border, down to Azure and the ways in which they enable tracking of undocumented migrants, right down to enabling Israeli security forces to also impart target acquisition systems on Gazans. Those are ways in which we become attuned to understanding how racial capitalism is global, is about border making, is about scapegoatism, is about identifying a perfect threat. In this case, the groupings that have the least amount of rights and the least amount of power under the institutions to which they are subjected to refuse those systems. And it becomes also clear that these are ways in which encodification of a social structure occurs, right? Like, it's not so much that the technologies themselves are so spectacular and so noteworthy that we notice them in our everyday as individuals who aren't necessarily, like, say, engaged in the struggle, as being somehow out of the ordinary. It's actually that they're so super ordinary by which in which we are exposed to these systems that they become a part of the social fabric and the social structure through which we operate and come to move our threshold for what we accept as permissible in terms of violence, as permissible in terms of genocidal proclivities, as permissible as far as the acceptance of even terms like apartheid, which, when we look back with retrospect in the context of South Africa, there is a very, small portion of people who would find excuses for that system. But if you situate that same language in the context of Palestine, it becomes somehow extra political and somehow subject to extra scrutiny and disagreement. And the reason why that is exactly because how these things become co-opted into the social fabric. And I think part of how that happens is through the technology. And so I'm really applauding this moment in which tech workers, migrants, justice advocates, Palestine organizers are coming together in trying to show exactly how these systems are in conversation with these larger dynamics of border imperialism, of racial capitalism, of global apartheid. And I think it brings us into a part of the conversation around what does concrete victories and concrete actions, as you pointed to, Malika, look like. And I want to talk a little bit more about this, and just because this is a conversation that Mizue, you and I have been grappling with a little bit over the last few weeks, in particular, if not years, just around what is it a non-reformist reform, and what would that look like in this context? Is it prohibitions on particular systems? But that really doesn't go far enough to address particular institutions and particular normative sets of rules that underlie those systems. Is it about, taking more drastic neo-Luddite action? And I can't have a single talk with Mizue without bringing up neo-Luddism. Like, is what we're looking at a new form of direct action against things like data centers, et cetera, that draws on the longer tradition of textile laborers' resistance to the increased concentration of power and labor exploitation in Manchester? What does it look like literally burning a data center? Like where are we putting our efforts and energies as far as the struggle is concerned? And I don't think the answer is necessarily that we have to direct everything towards neo-Luddism, because of course non-reformist reforms help do some things, while when done poorly obviously end up in situations in which co-option can occur, and that's obviously not desirable. But there are certain things, such as prohibitions, as I mentioned before, that mean that you are moving the onus of the burden of who the exception falls on as far as being subjected to a particular system away. So the crucial thing to, I think, appreciate about AI technologies and border technologies broadly is that they are fundamentally systems that build within them an acceptance of a constant state of exception for those who they are framed against, right? So if you're talking about borders technologies, what they are effectively framed as are technologies that incur violence against moving communities, and that is okay. And that, you're only really in the clear when the system accepts that your level of legibility is seen as a desirable form of legibility. And so until that point, you are under a state of exception, and that system itself puts you on that state of exception. By putting a prohibition on a particular system, you are calling into question whether that system should ever be allowed, and that only in a context in which the particular authority that intends to use the system can prove why they should be allowed to do so, should they be allowed to use that system. It moves the burden of making a claim of the exceptionality. However, that doesn't get away from the fact that institutions are really the problem here, right? States are apartheid states. States are border imperialist. States are where the border is and emanates from. But as far as getting to the conversation around what does a non-reformist reform look like here, I wonder if that's a starting point for our conversation, or whether that's a sort of a dead end, and we need to move towards more drastic neo-Luddite efforts. It's more of a question, I guess, for the rest of the panel and others taking part in this.
If anyone has the easy answer, I encourage you to unmute now. Miles, I see.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in, not an easy answer, but I'm intrigued that neo-Luddicism, how does that relate to abolition, right? Are those two sides of a different coin? Yeah, and thinking a lot about abolition in those answers there, thinking about bordering as statecraft, and thinking the way that prison industrial complex abolitionists look at the prison as a site of where state, like Ruthie frames it as where state building is like both the least contested, but also the most classed and racialized, right? And I think the border today really does do that same function, and a lot of what you've all discussed there, I think, really illustrates that. And so kind of like maintaining that kind of skepticism in, I was reminded a bit of Lisa Lowe's work in some of your answers there, and thinking about any sort of transition historical kind of within this system of kind of liberal capitalism towards supposedly kind of like more liberties and freedoms comes with actually just the displacement of that violence, right? So Matt, what you're talking about there is that kind of state of exception, just shifting and where that is, and that focus of who falls under that and who is still being like targeted. And so yeah, that kind of inherent skepticism that is required in any sort of organizing when we're seeing kind of the supposedly softer forms of border securitization. Which there's a lot to come back to. I'll move on for now. I do hope that we can kind of come back to thinking about that some of those questions in regards to some of the organizing that we'll be looking at in the reading group, but also some of the stuff that I know Migrants Organise are involved in. So it'd be great to hear some of that. But just first, I think kind of following on from that, in terms of like challenging that invisibilization or displacement, there's also kind of the general question of the way that a lot of conversations, and this has come up already today, tech tends to be quite mystified, right? And in spaces where conversations about tech are maybe less common, or where organizing is needing to shift to kind of incorporate tech, whether that's even just kind of like in so much of our organizing today, incorporating more security measures in how we relate to tech is increasingly important. But there's obviously, again, that mystification, that kind of feeling of uncertainty, and therefore an unwillingness to actually take on that work, right? Or to kind of a dependence to kind of like look to experts. Obviously, we're grateful to have some experts here today. But yeah, in terms of like the work being done in exposing and demystifying that, I think obviously this book is a great start for that. I know that Mizue, a lot of what Surveillance Resistance Lab is also that kind of like research and exposure, which is really effective. And I suppose I wanted to think about how that relates for you all to the work of political education. Obviously, this is part of a kind of like longer term project of a reading group that we hope will be able to replicate and adapt in different ways. But yeah, generally thinking about what the different kind of forms of organizing against these structures and technologies of violence looks like, and particularly how political education can help us move from that being a kind of like expert dependent to a part of all of our organizing more broadly.
Should I go? That's a great question. I guess I wanted to tell a little bit about the backstory of this book, because I think it kind of gets to your point. When I had met Matt, because I was doing work on ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. That's the interior police force that's been set up following the foundation of DHS in 2002. And it was, I think it was Trump times, where it was really horrifying, right? To be someone at potential threat of being targeted by ICE police. And so we had constructed like a map of all the different ICE raid tactics. And that was something that we were trying to help people know, is like, if you can see how they use ruses or kind of lies to get into your home, or the different ways that they're trying to find you, maybe this could be at least one way that you can protect your rights amidst this like incredible surveillance regime that they had set up. And so Matt was doing some work on some smart city technology. It's called Link NYC. It's a kiosk in New York that supposedly gives free Wi-Fi. But I think, one of the things that we've learned with the advent of this now kind of tech-fueled world is like nothing comes for free, right? Like they're getting data from you. They're collecting, and the ability then to collect like location data, share that data. It helps the corporations make money off of you, but it also then helps the cops find you. And it's a very like a glorious marriage for cops and corporations, I would say. So this was all happening at the same time that New York City, we had fought as advocates during the tail end of Obama, no, 2 years into Obama. 2014, kind of the end of a second administration Obama, to get a state-issued ID for undocumented people, mostly in New York City, because also as a city where I think in most places, if you don't have a state-issued ID, it can exclude you from many places. So this book came about as a toolkit because I was talking to Matt. We met Colleen, who the other co-editor, who had done work with people in refugee camps and biometrics collected on them, and how these biometrics collected on refugees were being fed into databases for the EU and the United States. And we had talked to people in Kenya and people in India who had been working against digital ID systems. We were talking to people in San Diego who had smart streetlights had now become like spy devices on communities. And I think the idea was, I was trying to bring this together in the campaign in New York City and the ID NYC. And I realized it was so difficult, in part because of what you said, Miles, and what I've heard Harsha say. It's like, oh, it's about tech. We don't understand. We have our tech experts, And you guys don't understand the risks because you're not tech experts. So the city weaponized the lack of like, this is a kind of knowledge that can only be held by those who are interestingly paid by MasterCard to come to New York City and tell you about what tech privacy is not or is not. So like when we founded the Surveillance Resistance Lab, it was really important, I think, to have a bit of an intervention here. It's like, it's not just about our privacy. It's really about power and democracy, right? And what is the collective study that we have to do to see how wherever we are in our organizing space, like the simplest way I've come up to say is like, who's occupying the solution space? I guarantee you it's cops and corporations, right? And where are the interventions then for you to actually play a role in the decision making and the power? And so I think really this point about normalization that we started with is really important, because I think I had this really interesting conversation with an organizer based in New York City who I think was maybe 24. And I gave a presentation on my usual spiel about like mass deportation, the rise of DHS and criminalization. And afterwards, she wrote me a message and said, I'm really embarrassed. I'm Muslim. I'm from New York. And I had no idea that DHS was founded after 9/11. I thought it always existed, right? And so this is like why I think it's like we put this book, it's not just the historical continuum. It's not just showing the process of bordering at all these different geographical scales, including the body. It's also trying to bring together all these different perspectives and ways people are fighting it, but how it's been so normalized in these tools of governance like ID systems or street lights or whatever it is that you would expect your government to provide for you. But also then again, importantly, how people are trying to think very creatively to fight against it in a context where they really are trying to figure out how to not get you to fight, right? Or to deprive you of as many rights as you can on that. The only other thing I wanted to add to that thing and kind of drawing on what Harsha was referring to in terms of border externalization, I think one of the things that was really like a real takeaway for me organizing around these issues in the United States is it's a global, like the American homeland is the planet. That's what they said. And so our solutions have to be global and internationalist, right? So to your point about non-reformist reforms, or your question, it's like if what you are doing is fighting for the rights of one group of people in a particular place, and then the government has a spatial fix, meaning like, well, actually what we really want to do is seal the border and make Mexico our southern border, right? And so I often tell people, and they're kind of surprised to hear that Mexico consistently deports more people from Central America than the US does over the entire decade of the Obama administration and up to now. Mexico now has grown a huge military force, right? So much of their civilian practices are militarized, and the US has so much to do with that between the drug war and the bordering regime. And so I think this is why we have to understand, kind of Miles, back to your question, like we have to understand like both the historical trajectory of how we got here, but then how all the different interests have kind of like converged in a way of governing and running people that benefits the power of the state and corporations over the people. And I think it's really context specific, right? What's happening in Mexico or the US border externalization regime is similar to the EU one, but it's not the same, right? The EU has to comply somewhat with some human rights guidelines. The United States has a constitution that's the rights for private property landholders, right? Like, so I think like these legal frames in which we are in are really important. And it's just important to really keep always asking questions and learning, but talking to people across borders is key.
Happy to come in here, if that's okay. Just to jump off of one thing that you said here, Mizue, and just add a little bit to it as well. I think it's important that we ground our work moving forwards in also an understanding that, going back to the sort of like non-reformist reforms and like what constitutes a rogue sort of hyper augmented, as it were, what's the word I'm looking for? Fascist state versus one that is ostensibly liberal, but is acting with some form of, forms of human rights safeguards. Like, I do think, like, they're in this instance, especially when it comes to the permissibility of particular forms of technology augmented violence, like two sides of the same coin, right? Like, yes, in the U.S., as you discussed, there's a constitution that doesn't allow for very much by way of protecting against the worst uses of particular forms of technology or particular, exercises of violence against particular communities on the move. And in the EU, we have GDPR and the EU AI Act, etc. Those regulations exist in part to make it permissible to use the very technologies that they address against the very communities that are harmed by it the most. The exceptions that exist, the exemptions that exist, for example, within the EU AI Act, which are precisely for states to be able to, withdraw from any prohibition or high-level risk indication of, for example, remote biometric surveillance technology, social scoring, etc., as long as it's national security oriented, is exactly the kind of permissible language that goes into a regulation that's celebrated at large as somehow bringing and restoring some form of order and rights to an otherwise wild west of technology, when in reality all that it does is facilitate and normalize and create a pathway for their usage, for the very uses that we would stand against, right? So I think our analysis needs to be, as you were saying, as Harsha has been saying, like so deeply rooted in understanding what is it exactly that these regulations and these frameworks, even the ones that purport to be connected to some form of vacuous notion of international human rights, is actually doing, right? What is it that it's allowing? What is it that it's foreclosing? And it appears, as far as communities on the move are concerned, as far as those that are the most marginalized by these technologies are concerned, they don't foreclose very much, and they create a huge array of permissibility. That's one. The other thing, going back to where we take this then, and this is plugging into the political education piece. I think, on the one hand, it's what Mizue talked about in terms of just elucidating and making clear these connections within the communities that we move in, and within the migrants justice community, within the abolitionist community, and tying up and weaving the sort of mosaic of multifaceted forms of violence and expressions of border imperialism and racial capitalism through tech. And on the other hand, I think the piece that I've become particularly attuned to being missing, and I feel woefully remiss for not fully realizing this until quite recently, is just how much of a disconnect there is also within tech workers until recently, and the tech community and the tech industry, in terms of how the particular products that are being developed plug into these wider systems, these wider logics, these wider applications of violence. Like, oftentimes when you go to a computer science department and you bring up this question of, should particular forms of technology, be it facial recognition, be it social scoring, be it like weird pseudoscientific eugenicist tools like race detection, should they be banned? Should they be allowed? You bring this conversation up, and the question is almost always like, why? Why should it be banned? This is science. This is tech. We should be allowed to build it. Why? Why not? It's and really what needs to be clear here, and what has become clear through conversations, to speaking to colleagues, to understanding better, like what actually drives a change of heart and a change of minds in this arena, is a clear understanding of exactly how down the pipeline of every component of this particular product, violations are enabled, violence is enabled. And we're not very good, I think, yet at communicating back that piece of the puzzle to the tech sector. And so I think part of our political education also must be necessarily to plug back into those spaces. And I think No Tech for Apartheid, the tech worker coalitions across the board have coordination with union organizers, the BDS movement, and Palestine solidarity groups, been very active in recent years in trying to bring to the fore those connections and that political education. But I think that needs to be taken even further, right? Like, what is the connection between your use of a particular product, between your institution's use of a particular product, between your academic and intellectual fascination with generative AI and violence and apartheid and border imperialism and racial capitalism. That we haven't been very good at, and I'd love to work more on. But yeah, I'll stop my monologue there. I apologize.
Thanks, both of you, for that. Yeah, Harsha or Malika, did either of you want to come in on that?
I wanted to maybe just jump in on the political education question quickly. I forget who said it, but something about the top-down sort of model of understanding the role of technology in structural violence. I feel like that is just so key, and I think something that feels really energized in this moment is kind of rethinking the relationship between research in particular and like advocacy and like grassroots movement building. In a way that can really dismantle this sort of like epistemic hierarchy of like, yes, you need an expert to explain this tech to you, so then you can decide what to do about it, or so that you can plug into a course of action that's been decided by someone else. Whereas actually with, I think in most cases, people experiencing the violence inflicted by tech forms of bordering know very well that it is border violence, and know very well that it needs to be resisted as part of a broader move to end the border, or to end the hostile environment in the UK, or to end imperialism. But what is often missing is the space to like make those connections. And I think that's something I'm really interested in exploring that space more, right? Like, how do we build those connections in a way that honors different kinds of knowledge about technology and different forms of resistance as just as important when we're deciding how we're resisting?
Thank you all for those. I'm thinking and taking notes, so this might be scattered, but one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of political education, in terms of technology, just in terms of your question, is I think so much of liberal opposition to technology, and I think someone referenced this, is framed around privacy, right? And so that makes it so on the one hand, there's the obfuscation and the technological aspect of technology, like feeling like one has to be an expert. And then there's also the sense that so much opposition to tech in the mainstream, the kind of primary mainstream opposition to it, is around the framework of privacy, which is a deeply, individualized capitalist model already. Not that privacy is a capitalist idea, but, that kind of opposition to like, well, if you're fine, if you have nothing to hide, then what's the problem? Or, I'm fine with Meta collecting all my data, like that kind of opposition. And so I think part of it in terms of popular education is not only kind of unearthing the forms of technology, but also just reframing these kinds of technologies as technologies of surveillance and militarism and racism, right? Like that this is not about having to relearn every new technology, even though that may be important. But again, like to our earlier point, these are accelerations of existing processes that we are already in resistance to. And I think that reframing from like needing to understand every single technology, I'm not saying that's not important, like that has a role, but in terms of mass popular education, I think reframing it from issues of privacy to like surveillance and militarism, as people are increasingly doing, I think is a key kind of method around popular education, right? It makes it more accessible. It locates it within an existing understanding and trajectory of violence. So I think that is incredibly important. I've also been thinking a lot around, again, within this kind of conversation around how do we see it as a continuation, is to also make between border technologies and just increasingly technologies that are used against workers, right? So like thinking about Amazon and all the kind of quote unquote efficiencies that these technologies are intended to accelerate. And what would it mean to understand all of these technologies as an extension of the plantation economy, right? Like the Black radical tradition teaches us that the plantation economy already incorporates and is like intrinsically, since its foundation, been based on the logics of surveillance, control, population management, and labor extraction and enslavement, right? Like those are the foundations of the plantation economy. And all of these technologies accelerate all of these processes in tandem, differently, but in tandem. And so to locate technologies and these kinds of exploitative violent technologies as continuum specifically of the plantation economy that is still the world today, I think is also important as a kind of praxis and how we're thinking about popular education around technologies. And again, I offer this as someone who doesn't understand technology, right? So like these are the ways that I try to make sense of them in my organizing. And then the last thing, and Matt, you were talking about this, right? Is like, and Miles, you too, is like just a consistent orientation towards skepticism. Like that is a methodological necessity in all organizing, right? Because power is consistently reconfiguring itself. Technology is just one aspect of how power reconfigures itself, and across space, as you were mentioning, Mizue, right? Like how does it configure across time and space and the spatial fixes that technology facilitates? And so I think also just an orientation of skepticism is important, and especially important because sometimes not understanding technology can make skepticism harder because we think we're missing something, right? This idea of like, I don't understand. And I think as organizers and as people who live in this world through a model and an ethic of resistance, skepticism is sometimes enough. Like, I don't need to understand how every technology works to understand that like this technology is fucked because, as you said, right, like who gains from the solution? It's the cops and private corporations. Sometimes that is enough as an organizer to know that shit's fucked, right? Like I don't have to be an expert. And so I think also trusting our instincts as organizers, that sometimes we don't have to know all the details. We benefit from knowing them, but our ethics and how we move are sometimes good enough to be like, no, this technology just sounds fucked. People are going to get caught in this massive surveillance web. And that is what I need to move forward, right? And so I think some of those in terms of popular education are critically important around tech, because it can be so disempowering when we don't understand it. And so to reground ourselves that these are continuations of existing logics, and how does this fit into an existing logic, is perhaps an easier starting point than like, I need to research every single technology and become overwhelmed by it, which is not in any way to suggest a lack of nuance or like a lack of our own rigor, but to also remind ourselves that we have the skill set to move forward as we get bombarded with all of this tech.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all for those answers. Sorry. I thought, yeah, that captures a lot of that. I think really kind of speaking to that kind of in the face of the disempowering feeling that a lot of that kind of this topic can have. It is so empowering also to be able to be in a space like this and learn from all four of you and from resources like these books. So thank you so much.
All right. On the theme of action and orienting ourselves from knowledge to action, the last kind of question for the speakers is about demands, and if there are calls to action, demands, resources, and things that you would like to share with those who are tuned in today, if there are movements or campaigning groups that you want to shout out, or initiatives that you're working on in your various fields. Matt, maybe can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, shout out to BDS, of course. They're organizing a tremendous number of not just actions, but also talks that are fundamentally about political education, and even around this topic of understanding the historical entanglement between tech and the growth of the biometric sector and the AI sector, and apartheid, going back to the mid 20th century and into the current moment, and would follow them, and take lead from them on this as well. NOTA, No Tech for Apartheid in particular, has been organizing incredibly around tech complicity in this issue, and I think also bring a nuanced and important angle to the broader issue, in not only holding that we deny and refuse to develop these technologies, but we also find it as our duty to develop ways in which we educate others and help bring others on board with why these contracts need to be dropped and why the current forms of these tech companies are incompatible with the kinds of futures that we seek. And I think that's, an incredibly just potent message, and also a good one to pay attention to at this particular juncture for those of you who are in particular interested in tackling and understanding and getting into the issue of tech worker and tech industry resistance to apartheid. Obviously, I want to shout out the Surveillance Resistance Lab and the work that Mizue is doing with her group. It's a really important group of folks, the radical folks that are working on a tremendous amount of elucidation of exactly how ICE and the Homeland Security apparatus gets its hands on technologies, infrastructures, entire infrastructures and pipelines that shuffle folks into undesirable categories and lines them up for deportation, separation, and beyond. And so do check out their site and their work. And I would shout out also No Tech for Tyrants, who have been doing awesome work in the UK around, in particular, higher education entanglements with tech companies and the hostile immigration environment, but also broadly around tech and the hostile immigration environment, and are active on various university campuses in the UK and beyond too. But I'll leave it there. Thank you all for tuning in.
I just wanted to jump in to say, similarly, there's a lot of great work being done. I've mentioned some of the Palestine solidarity organizing earlier. Again, I think we haven't spoken about it much today, but the student encampment movement has illustrated a lot of the ways of surveillance technologies are involved in a lot of systems that don't just touch the border or traditional forms of state violence. And then particularly within the UK, migrant justice organizing recently, thinking a lot about, when we talk about technologies, also what are the legal technologies of securitization and criminalization. And so groups like Captain Support that really look at the way that the law has been transforming to adapt to criminalize different sorts of border crossings and movement is really important, and it's work that I'd really support, as well as the incredible work of Migrants Organise, who I'm very grateful to be collaborating with on this project. So thank you all again.
Someone was going to talk about abolished reporting.
I can talk about abolished reporting. At Migrants Organise in the UK here, we're part of many different campaigns for migrant justice against the hostile immigration environment, which is the UK's system of essentially making everyday life difficult and undignified and unbearable for migrants. And one of the ways that happens is through immigration bail reporting conditions that looks like in-person physical reporting appointments, but over the past couple of years has expanded to more digital forms of surveillance, including ankle bracelets with 24/7 GPS surveillance. So as part of that, we're working to put pressure on Serco, the company that has the £200 million contract for ankle tags, as well as on the Home Office to end the reporting system. So if you want to get involved and take action with abolish reporting or with any of the other campaigns that Migrants Organise up to around healthcare, legal aid, housing justice, and surveillance in the UK, please do get in touch, and we'd love to organize together. Mizue or Harsha, did you want to jump in? Otherwise, I think we're pretty close to closing.
I think Matt mentioned a whole bunch. Thank you for that, Matt. I just wanted to say, just because it hasn't come up a whole lot in conversation, but would really encourage folks to also check out a lot of the resistance happening in the context of India, because India is another epicenter of the surveillance state. And specifically, I mean, not exclusively, but explicitly also to look at specifically Kashmir and Punjab and the ways in which, I mean, right now there's opposition to the increasing border security forces, both the expansion of and the increasing surveillance of the border into Punjab. And of course, Kashmir is, you know, one of the most militarized, occupied places on the planet. So just to add that into the conversation, and so many lessons to be gleaned also from places outside of the core, although India is arguably the core as well. But
thanks, Harsha. And yeah, thank you all for your amazing contributions to this conversation. I also want to shout out, Miles hasn't said anything, but the Solidarity Detainee Support Group based in the UK, SDS, as well as the other amazing organizing work that Books Against Borders are doing, is really worth getting involved with. And with that, I think we're ready to close out. So just to say again, thank you, a huge thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to the Haymarket team for setting this up and making this possible. The book Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence is available through Haymarket. You should grab a copy if you don't have one. And if you're in London and joining us for the in-person reading group with organizers, we are really excited to be digging into these questions with you. As Miles mentioned, we'll have another online event after the last session of the reading group on October 23rd, where we'll hopefully share some learnings and insights, though we cannot promise any easy answers to these questions. But until then, we wish you all the best and sending solidarity and strength to you wherever you're tuned in.
thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.